I remember a case I was involved in a number of years ago as a defence lawyer based out in Nhulunbuy, and for those of you who've worked in remote territory communities, the scene would be all too familiar. It was at the end of a long bush court day, what we call bush courts, which is when the court flies out to remote communities once a month, once every 3 months, depending on the community. We would often have 70, 80 matters listed on a day, split between 2 lawyers, 1 corrections officer, 1 magistrate. And in this particular case, the thing that stood out to me was that I had no one left to blame. Usually as a defence lawyer, I could find all sorts of people to blame. An unsympathetic magistrate, a corrections worker who just wouldn't do their job properly, the lack of rehabilitation facilities, the lack of anger management counselling, sometimes just the lack of time itself, not enough time to do a proper job. But in this particular case, I'd run out of people to blame. The magistrate who was sitting on the bench was a very balanced, sympathetic magistrate with a lot of experience working in Aboriginal communities, much more experience than I had had. The corrections officer was one that I had a very good working relationship with, and I knew she did her job well. She knew what she was doing, and she took her job very seriously. Even the police prosecutor was very reasonable, which is high praise coming from a former defence lawyer. And so we're sitting in the courtroom at the end of a long day, 4 white faces and 1 Aboriginal man who spoke English as probably his 4th or 5th language. He spoke one of the Yolngu languages as his first language, and usually people are multilingual in several of the Yolngu languages. And as I was sitting there going through the motions, it was the last case of the day, so we had time. There weren't the usual time pressures to finish off the matter and get the next person in. And sitting there, going through the usual sentencing processes, and I caught the magistrate's eye, and I don't want to infer what she was thinking, but I feel like we both just gave each other that look of, here we go again, what are we doing? Is anything good going to come out of this process? And for those of you who have worked in areas, situations where you have culturally diverse, linguistically diverse offenders or clients, you've probably encountered very similar situations where you have that feeling, that unsettling feeling, that it's just not quite working. Something's not quite working the way I would like it to be working. A lot of us will intuitively try and adapt what we do if we realise that maybe the person's not understanding, what I'm saying doesn't make a lot of sense to them, or when I said this, they went and did this. Was it because they ignored me, or maybe there was some miscommunication? So we start to try and adapt what we do, which is good. It's good that we identify when something is not working. The problem, however, is that more often than not, it ends up being a trial and error type of approach. That didn't work. I'll try doing it this way. Now I'll try doing it this way. Sometimes it seems to be more effective and we communicate better. Other times it doesn't seem to work, but we're not really sure what made this situation work and what made this situation not work. What I'd like to walk through today and propose is that as practitioners in this space, we need to do a much better job of assessing the communication we have with our clients. We put a lot of work into the content that we're going to work with. We put a lot of work into the programs that we're going to work through. We put a lot of work into gathering information, creating plans and all the rest of it. And so often I think we trip just before the finish line. We've gotten everything ready, and then when it comes to actually engage, interact with the client, we let ourselves down. There's a lot of, I would say, wasted time and effort because we fail to communicate properly. So communication is the vehicle that will enable all the rest of your hard work to pay off and actually come to fruition. Very, very briefly, for those of you who aren't from the Territory, we have phenomenal diversity in the Northern Territory. We have over 100 Aboriginal languages and dialects that are still spoken today. We're very fortunate in that so many of these languages are still living languages. On a day-to-day basis in our courts, we're probably dealing with around 15 to 20 languages. And the language sizes vary, probably from around 6,000 to 8,000 for the larger languages, down to, of those 20 languages, down to about 500 to 800 speakers. And then, of course, you have a number of languages with far less speakers. So everything that I'm going to be saying today, proposing today, is a generalisation. I'm not wanting to say that it's true in every single situation. Some situations it will not be true. But these are tools that you can use to assess communication and improve communication. If you find that they don't apply in a particular situation with a particular client, then chuck them out and don't use it. But if you find that they are helping and useful, then that's great. And at least it gives you a mechanism to go, this is why this seems to work better, this is why this doesn't seem to work so well. So to start off with, I'd like to try and just put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who might be engaging with the criminal justice system through their second language. For those of you who have learnt another language, you'll probably have some sympathy of what it feels like when you're only catching every fourth or fifth word, or even when you understand every word they say but you've got no clue what they mean, and the feeling that gives you when you're just feeling lost and trying your best to keep up. For those of you who haven't yet learnt a second language, it may be slightly harder to put yourself in that position. But I'll give a quick story from my time in China. At university, I studied Chinese Mandarin, and I spent some time in China furthering that study. And I developed my Chinese to a reasonable level. Conversations were no problems. I was in and around a university, so I was starting to develop some higher level vocab and confidence. And one day I got into a conversation with a number of my Chinese university friends, university students who I was good friends with. I'd been seeing them just about every day for a number of months. Something came on the news about the US sending warships into the Taiwan Strait. And me being a law student and a passionate defender of democracy and human rights, couldn't resist the opportunity to jump in and have a talk about this. So one of the Chinese students made a comment along the lines of, oh, there goes America interfering in our internal affairs again. And so I very quickly went back, well, I'm not sure the Taiwanese would see it as internal affairs. And of course, the gloves were off and it was on. What unfolded was very, very interesting because I realised I'd bitten off far more than I could chew. My ability to communicate all of the ideas that I had about concepts of democracy, human rights, the rights of people to choose, I couldn't do that in Chinese Mandarin. I had no words to do that. And so the equivalent of what I started to say was basically, everyone should choose. If they choose, we should listen to what they say. If they want to be free, they should be free. That was the sum total of my nuanced, powerful argument to my Chinese friends as to why they should respect Taiwan's desire for independence. And of course, they were coming back with their own arguments, which I was not getting. I was missing the nuance and the depth of their arguments. And the conversation very quickly degenerated into simple statements because they thought that I had no argument. What I was saying sounded infantile, and what I was understanding them to say sounded equally infantile. And so we certainly made no progress. I didn't persuade them of anything. They didn't persuade me of anything other than, I don't think you've got a very good argument, and I don't think you've got a very good argument. And we never talked about the topic again. We realised it was pointless. We couldn't communicate on it. We weren't going to go anywhere. And so there's a few things that come into that. When we ask somebody to express themselves, to talk in a second language, we are forcing them to limit what they can communicate to us. We often think about language issues, the use of interpreters, purely from the point of view of, do they understand me? Can they understand what I'm saying? Maybe I should get an interpreter in to help them understand what I'm saying. Maybe I should change the way I say it so they can understand me better. But an equally important part of this process is, can the person fully express themselves? If they cannot fully express themselves, they cannot fully participate in whatever it is that you're asking them to participate in. People they experience the world and they retain the memories of their experiences in their first language. What they experience is like this. And then when we ask them to tell us, so how did you feel when you were doing that? Why did you assault that person? Why didn't you turn up to your job? All of these kind of questions. They're trying to take all of these experiences and funnel them through the limited words that they have. And so what ends up getting communicated is a much more simple, underwhelming expression of what they've actually experienced. So we actually limit people's ability to participate when we force them to engage with us in a second language. And for those of you that come from an educational background, you'd be very, very aware, particularly for adults, participation is a key to learning. As adults, we learn best when we are actively involved, when we are part of what's happening, not when we simply sit back and listen like all of you guys are doing right now. This quote, I think, sums it up nicely. It's a general cross-cultural communication quote. It's not been written specifically for Aboriginal people. People tend to avoid communicating with persons whom they know or anticipate will not have adequate command of a language common to both parties to permit ease of communication. It is uncomfortable and embarrassing not to understand what a person is saying or not to have them understand you. Our ability to, for lack of a better word, get inside of somebody's head, to understand their motivations, to understand the reasons that they've done something or not done something, is absolutely crucial and fundamental for our effectiveness in getting them to change thinking, change patterns of behaviour, change to rehabilitate. And if we cannot get a clear picture of why people are doing things, of why people have reacted, of the reasons that they're using internally, if we're getting only a very limited picture, the tools that we're going to be using to try and address those things will be insufficient and will be off the mark. So the overall premise, I guess, that I would like you to hopefully take away from today is a lot of the work that we do in the criminal justice space, particularly those of you who are in community corrections, is around rehabilitation. It's around changing behaviour. It's around correcting behaviour. And that is fundamentally a learning process. When we're asking somebody to start doing things they've never done before, or to ask somebody to start reacting in different ways than they used to react, to respond in different ways that they did before, to start going to work every day when they've never gone to work every day before, to show up and report 3 times a week when they've never kept appointments in their life before, we're asking them to learn new skills. We're asking them to change their behaviour. But rarely, I think, do we approach it from a learning framework and ask the question, what will most effectively help this person to learn the new behaviours and skills that they need to exhibit the behaviours that I'm trying to see? And where it gets further complicated is, even if we intuitively put ourselves in that space, if we go, oh, how are they understanding this? How are they hearing this? The problem is, particularly in the territory context, or not the problem, but the complexity, the challenge, is that traditional Aboriginal learning styles differ very, very greatly from Western learning styles. And so the things that we do intuitively to help somebody learn may work for somebody who comes from the same learning background as you, but they're unlikely to work or work effectively for somebody who's come from a very different learning background and a very different learning paradigm. And in fact, some of the things that we can do to try and enhance learning can actually be counterproductive and block learning, because of the difference in learning styles and approaches to learning. So one of the things that I think we need to do is to put the responsibility on ourselves. I know that all of us take our work seriously, but to say that as the professionals, as the ones who are trying to see change, as the ones who are trying to help somebody move from A to B, we bear the responsibility both for communicating effectively and for creating an environment where a person can learn the new skills and behaviours that we would like them to see. And we don't blame them when things don't go according to plan. That's the easy cop-out answer, I would say, is to say, well, they didn't understand me. They didn't change what they were doing like I told them to. I'm not trying to take free will out of the equation, but in terms of us doing what we can do, we need to take that on ourselves and actually assess and say, what went wrong in that communication process? How could I do it better? We do a lot of assessments. We do risk assessments. We do all sorts of other assessments. How often do we actually stop before we engage with a client who comes from a different cultural or linguistic background and do an assessment of the communication needs, do an assessment of the learning needs before we then proceed to the substantive or content part of what we're doing? Another quote I enjoy about communication: all communication is based on shared information. It may include shared language structures, culture, previous conversations, having read the same material, a common experience, etc. One of the first questions that I think is useful to ask ourselves is, to what extent is my experience of the world similar or different to this person's experience of the world? If the home I go home to at the end of the day is incredibly different from the home they go home to, if my experience of work, my experience of education, my experience of family are all very, very different from their experience of these things, then there's a much higher likelihood that we're going to have difficulty communicating, because the concepts and the meaning that I attach to words, the way that I see the world, is likely to be significantly different than somebody who has a very similar set of background experiences. And again, it's very complex. I like to think of things on a spectrum. You've got traditional Aboriginal communication styles, traditional Aboriginal learning styles, through to Western communication styles. Every client is going to be different. Not everybody is going to react the same way. Not everybody is going to exhibit the same communication patterns and tendencies. But at least if we know and have an awareness of what traditional Aboriginal communication styles and learning styles are on one end, and an awareness of what our own assumptions are on the other end, we can then get a picture of where we are in that interactional space, where on the spectrum we're sitting. Now, I've talked enough. I'd like to, in keeping with this idea of putting ourselves in the shoes of somebody who doesn't speak English as a first language, I'd like to show a clip. It's a little bit longer than we'd ordinarily watch at something like this. It runs for about 6 minutes. This was filmed at a conference a year ago in the Supreme Court, and very briefly, the background is that we ran a court scene in Yolngu-Matha. So Yolngu-Matha interpreters played the role of the judge, defence lawyer, prosecution, and we asked Justice Mildren, one of the Supreme Court judges, to play the role of the defendant. So he sat in the dock, and he had no briefing other than to say, when they ask you if you're guilty or not guilty, you're guilty. Quite a while to convince the interpreters to say those things about a judge. They were absolutely certain that they would get locked up, but I managed to convince them in the end. What I'd like to do, actually no, I'm going to skip this, we're running short of time. So, what I'd like to do now is talk about a concept called first language interference. And it's really quite simple, but it's the idea that when somebody learns a second language, that there's an element of interference in terms of how they both speak and understand that second language that comes from their first language. It makes a lot of sense. In one sense, they think in their first language, they feel in their first language, and then they're trying to attach the words and sentences in their second language. So we find consistently that people will speak a second language. People who come from the same first language background will learn and speak a second language, making the same types of mistakes, the same types of patterns. And you would expect in many ways that a native speaker of Japanese who learns English as a second language will end up speaking English different than a native speaker of German who learns English. So what I'd like to do now is actually give you some practical tools. These are features of English that often don't exist in Aboriginal languages or aren't easily replicated in Aboriginal languages. And just to be clear, there's an equal number of features of Aboriginal languages that we can't replicate in English. But at the moment, I'm just talking about the one direction from English to an Aboriginal person who speaks English as a second language. And I'm also willing to say that there's been a lot of work done, linguistic work done, showing that many Aboriginal people who speak what's referred to as Aboriginal English, which linguists call a dialect, a non-standard dialect of English, often reflect these same features. So even for somebody who's speaking English or Aboriginal English as their first language, a lot of what I'm going to talk about here remains true. So the first one is passives. This is going to seem like a little bit of a grammatical lesson, but it's very useful. Passives are when we don't say who did something. We take the actor out of it. A sentence like, the bag was stolen, the car was smashed up, she was assaulted. We've never said who did it. And particularly as a defence lawyer, we love passives because it leaves things ambiguous and it softens the blow. Much easier to say, yes, it's unfortunate the victim was assaulted, than to say, yes, it was unfortunate that my client punched the victim 2 times. The passive makes it ambiguous and it softens the blow. Many Aboriginal languages don't have a passive function. They need to say who the actor is, who did it. So here's a few examples just of things that, rather than saying you will be punished, say the judge will punish you. You're actually saying who did it. Rather than saying your orders were varied last week, say last week I, if you were the one who varied the orders, or the judge or whoever it was that varied the orders. Last week I changed your orders, and I would actually encourage you to go beyond just using the term orders. You were breached for non-compliance of your orders and arrested soon after. You can see there's 2 passives here. You were breached, we didn't say who breached them, and we didn't say who arrested them. So turning that into active tense. You did not follow your orders, so I breached you. That is why the police arrested you on Tuesday. Very simple, usually very easy to change a passive into an active, but if you're communicating to an Aboriginal person who speaks English as a second language, the passive sentences will inherently be confusing, and they will have to spend a lot more time trying to work out who did it, why did they do it, what exactly are you going on about. You put it in the active tense, much, much easier. If you don't know who did something, for example, the car was stolen, you can just say, someone stole the car. They stole the car. And it turns it into an active tense. Abstract nouns. Again, abstract nouns are things that we can't touch, see, feel. They're intangibles, things like love and joy and peace. Love is in the air. Ask an interpreter to interpret that. The way that you deal with an abstract noun, and again, just as the linguistic basis for this is, Aboriginal languages do have abstract nouns, got plenty of them, but they tend not to switch back and forth between a word that's a verb, changing it into an abstract noun, or an adjective, changing it into an abstract noun. An example in English would be the term run. Run, it's an action, it's a verb. We run, I don't do much of it, but some people run. But we also turn it into a noun, saying you go for a run. We've turned it from a doing word into a thing. That's the type of flexibility that we do a lot of in English. Most Aboriginal languages don't do that as frequently or as easily. So things like during police questioning, and guaranteed there's not going to be a one-for-one word for the term questioning in Aboriginal languages because it's an abstract noun. During police questioning, you said, turn it to when police asked you about this, you said, you've turned it into an action rather than an abstract noun. After serving your term of imprisonment, you will, after you get out of prison, you will, Again, imprisonment, it's an abstract concept. Getting out of jail is an action. Your orders clearly say that you, the third one there, the judge gave you rules that you must follow. These rules say, etc., etc. Now, rules is still an abstract noun. If you're working with an interpreter, check whether they've got an equivalent of that. Generally, rules is okay for most of our interpreters. Your orders, for the period of your supervision, so again, two abstract nouns there. Period is an abstract concept and supervision is an abstract concept. The judge said that I must supervise you for 1 year. While I supervise you, you must Now, you ideally should even break down the concept supervise. Say, what I mean when I say supervise is that I will do this, 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 and this. Now, I will supervise you for this length of time, and then you must do this. Negative questions. These are a doozy. The reason being that English actually answers negative questions in the opposite way to most other languages in the world. Let's say, taking this first example, that I didn't report on Wednesday. If you ask me the question, didn't you report on Wednesday? I would say, no, I didn't report on Wednesday. If you ask me the question, did you report on Wednesday? I would still say, no, I didn't report on Wednesday. You've asked me the opposite question, and I give you the same answer, and it has the same meaning. English is very confusing in this sense. Aboriginal languages, if you ask the question, and this is true for many other languages, didn't you report on Wednesday? Somebody would say yes, because the question is, didn't you report? Yes, I didn't report. You never went to see the clinician last week, did you? Am I already confusing you? Once you start thinking about it, you get an insight into how confusing it can be. So, you never went to see the court clinician last week, did you? No. That means I didn't go see the court clinician. For a person who speaks an Aboriginal language as their first language, they could very easily say no, meaning yes. The statement is, you never went, and the answer is no. That's not true. I did go. The opposite answer, you can just imagine how many times this arises. So you didn't report, so you didn't go to the alcohol assessment, so you never went there, and we start the ball rolling already on the wrong foot, assuming that the person has said the opposite thing. Now, again, the good thing is negative questions can very easily be turned into positive questions. Just get rid of the negative. Did you report on Wednesday? Did you go see the clinician last week? Do you want to go to that program? This is probably the most complex one, which is the use of hypotheticals. In English, these are usually marked by if and or. There's a great little book called White Men Are Liars, and it's got a whole bunch of stories about government interactions with Aboriginal communities and how those interactions have been perceived by the communities to be on behalf of the government workers, that they've been lying. One of the underlying reasons for this is most Aboriginal languages, the closest term to the word if is the word when. So the statement, if we get money, we're going to build you 50 new houses, will get interpreted or heard as, when we get money, we're going to build you 50 new houses. Well, you didn't build us 50 new houses, you're a liar. We use if all the time, especially in legal processes, because everything is conditional upon something else. If this happens, then this is going to happen. If this happens, then this is going to happen. If this happens, then this is going to happen. Very, very difficult to deal with. The best way that we've worked out to deal with this is through the use of the term maybe. And you always give all the possibilities, all the potential possibilities. So the example here, if the corrections officer approves, you can go to the football game. Now there's a couple things that have gone on here. You haven't said what will happen if they don't approve. It's implied, it's implicit. That little word if implies that if they don't say, then you can't go. But we haven't said that. It's all built into that one word if. So a much better way to unpack that: you must ask the corrections officer about going to the football game. Maybe she will say that you can go to the football game. Maybe she will say you cannot go. You must do what she says. So you've given both possibilities and made it clear that you must do what she says. You can report on Wednesdays or Fridays. Which do you prefer? Maybe you want to come and see me at the office on Wednesday. Maybe you want to see me on Friday. You tell me which day you want to come see me. Again, because the or is a hypothetical. It could be this or it could be this. We don't know. So you've indicated using the term maybe that both are options. You choose and you tell me. If the test comes back positive, you will be in breach of your order. Now, I've chucked a whole bunch of issues in here to try and unpack. I will test you to find out if you have been drinking or whatever else it is that you're testing for. Maybe the test will show me that you were drinking. Maybe the test will show me that you were not drinking. If the test shows me that you were drinking, I will tell the judge that you did not follow the rules that she gave you. Now, you'll probably point out that I have used the term if there. The reason that works there is if you interpret that if as a when, the statement still works. So I leave it as if because it's far more natural in English to say if, but it hasn't confused the meaning. Another really important one is putting things in chronological order, which another way to think about it is also putting cause before effect. In English, we have a tendency to put the effect before the cause. Something as simple as come inside because it's raining. Cause and effect is it's raining, so come inside. But we put things around the opposite way. So something like, you're going to be imprisoned for 1 month because you didn't comply with your orders. The judge gave you rules to follow. You didn't follow these rules. That is why the judge is putting you in jail for 1 month. You must change your place of residence because your current residency is not assisting with your rehabilitation. The people in the house where you are staying now are making it hard for you to follow your orders. That is why I am telling you to find another place to live. Cause and effect. I'll skip this one as well. The next thing that I want to go... Now, is that too much of a grammatical lesson, or are there things that you can take away from it? One of the things that I'd like to, to leave with you is there is a system to communication and miscommunication. It's not just random. It's not just that people don't get it. There's reasons why this is happening. And if we can identify and pin down those reasons, then we can overcome those barriers. So even if when you walk out of the door today, you can't suddenly miraculously adapt your speech to cut out all abstract nouns and passives and put everything you say in chronological order, which I've been working on it for years and I still don't get it right, but at least you're aware. At least when you come to that situation where the person is giving you a blank look or there seems to be uncertainty, you can quickly assess and go, now what did I just say? Oh, hang on, I used an abstract noun. Okay, let me just change that doing word and see if that works and makes the communication more effective. The next thing I want to go to, so those are some practical tools. I want to get slightly more theoretical, but then draw some practicality out of it. This is in the topic of Aboriginal learning style. So this goes back to the idea that if we are asking people to change their behaviour, if we are trying to help and assist people to change their actions, develop new patterns and ways of doing things, we need to be doing that in a way that makes sense with their inbuilt patterns for learning. Because if we teach according to our patterns for learning, we may not actually be assisting somebody else to learn if they come from a different learning background. I'm going to skip through this. They're all on the slide, so I expect you all to read through them. So, very briefly, these are some key principles of adult learning generally. Any of you that come from an educational background will be familiar with them. There's a number of other principles, but I've just pulled out a small handful that are particularly relevant. Firstly, adults must want to learn. There needs to be inner motivation. Adults learn best through participation, through a skills focus, rather than just information dumping, through actually doing and through saying, I'm involved in this and it's making a change in my life. Adults are not a blank slate. This is particularly important working cross-culturally. We consciously and unconsciously filter new information through our prior experiences and beliefs. And standing up here, I'm very conscious that what I'm saying, all of you are going to be accepting it and receiving it to different degrees based on your experience and based on your beliefs about communication, cross-cultural interaction. And to a certain degree, on this large scale, there's nothing I can do about it. When I sit down one-on-one, we can actually say, now what do you think? What have your experiences been? And then I can tailor my message to your experiences. But you will all of us, inevitably filter new information through what we already believe and what we already accept. An example, and this is perhaps dangerous to use in the Northern Territory, but if I say, last month, driving north up from Alice Springs up to Tennant Creek, I saw several UFOs. Now, most of you have probably already rejected that statement. Now, I'm not actually saying that I saw UFOs. I saw a few worried looks on some faces there. Most of you have immediately rejected that statement because you don't believe that UFOs exist. It has nothing to do, in one sense, with what I said. It has everything to do with what you already believe. And that's just a very easy example of how we filter. We receive information that conforms to what we believe, and we reject information that doesn't conform to what we believe. So if what you're telling a client to do, what you're asking them to do, doesn't make sense in the paradigm they've already got, doesn't align with the beliefs that they've already got about the world, they're not going to take that on board, they're not going to incorporate it as easily. Whereas if it lines up with what they believe, if it makes sense in their world, then they're going to internalize it and they're going to be able to act on it much, much better. And then another one that's particularly important, negative concerns or stress, which may not be related to what we're talking about, will actually detract from our ability to learn. So if some of you have come here this morning and you've just had a massive fight with your partner, or you've just been told that you've got 1 week to get out of your job, you've been fired, chances are you're going to be thinking much more about that than about what I'm saying. And so what you take away from this session will be much less than somebody else who's got no stresses at the moment, or much less limited stresses. So you've got to be particularly aware that when you're dealing with people in stressful situations, a large percentage of their thinking capacity is going to be taken up with the stress of what they're feeling and the stress of the unknown of what they're going to experience, either when they get out of prison or whether they're going to comply with orders or whatever else it is. And they're going to be thinking about that much more than about what you are actually talking to them in that particular moment. So sometimes you need to deal with those other stresses first before you come back to the topic that you want to deal with. So that's just generic adult learning theory. Now, if we go more specific to common features of Aboriginal learning styles, and I guess one of the areas where I'm coming from with this is in the Aboriginal Interpreter Service. We have 30 on-staff full-time Aboriginal interpreters and over 400 casual Aboriginal interpreters. It's a fairly massive training program. Those interpreters need not just basic generalised training in interpreting, but they also need specialised training to be court interpreters or to be health interpreters, to be legal interpreters, those kinds of things. So it's a very, very large training program that we run. We've got Steve, one of our trainers, and also Walpry interpreter up the back. And in order to be effective in our training, we have to actually stop and say, how do you learn best? Not just, this is how we like to deliver training. And so there's a number of common key features of Aboriginal learning styles. Learning tends to occur through observation and emulation or imitation, rather than a question and answer format. It's learning through doing. Learning through doing, rather than just learning through talking. Learning occurs by doing in a real-life situation, rather than contrived or artificial settings. So very hard, I guess I'll go on here, theoretical explanations that are disconnected from reality are ineffective teaching tools, and hypothetical scenarios have limited effect. Now, a practical application of this in a traditional Western learning style, we ask a lot of questions and we ask people to respond to hypotheticals. So something like, now, when you go back to see your family, what are you going to do if one of them asks you to have a drink with them? What are you going to do when your cousin asks you again to go stay at that community for a few weeks? What are you going to do? These are hypothetical situations. It works naturally and intuitively in a Western learning model. not particularly effective in a traditional Aboriginal learning model. A much more effective way to do that would be to tell a story about yourself, about another client, obviously not giving their name, or about a friend of yours, so something along the lines of, I had another client a few years back. He got out of prison. He also had an order where he couldn't drink alcohol. He went back to his family, and his family really put a lot of pressure on him to drink. But every time they would start to say to him, come on, sit down and have a drink with us, he would say, oh, I've got to go visit my granny because I promised her last week that I would go and see her today. And so then he would leave, and he didn't get pulled into that temptation. Teaching point made. Much more effectively than what would you do if, hypotheticals, abstracts, questioning. Listening to the teacher is not necessarily demonstrated physically through actions such as looking at the teacher, making eye contact, remaining still, or not speaking to others. This probably arises more in community meeting type of sessions. You see a lot of government workers who are running community meetings get very, very uncomfortable by the fact that people are not displaying Western listening styles. You all are very, very good listeners. You're all giving me eye contact, you're not talking with each other, you're not playing on your iPads. That's what we expect in a Western learning system. Sorry, is somebody playing on their iPad? No. That's not expected behaviour in a traditional Aboriginal learning context. People don't have to be facing you, they don't have to have, they could have their back to you, they could be looking like they're doing other things. Without jumping into a whole nother kettle of things, basically Aboriginal communication styles are listener-oriented rather than speaker-oriented. In Western communication styles, the person who is talking has control. That's why at meetings, everybody fights to be the one who's talking, and if you haven't said anything for half an hour, you'll say something just so that people hear your voice and you get a bit of control back. Aboriginal communication styles are listener-oriented. Anybody can talk, anybody can say anything, you don't have to listen. So the power is with the listener. It's up to them to tune into what you're saying or to tune out of what you're saying. There's no obligation just because you're talking that they give you eye contact and they listen to you. It's a listener-oriented society rather than a speaker-oriented communication pattern. Now this comes into play in a very practical way in the use of silence. In English, and at law we even have a phrase for it, silence construes consent. It's this idea that if you're with people and they're saying something or doing something and you don't disagree with it, then you've implicitly agreed with it. So by not disagreeing, you agree. Silence in Aboriginal languages, communication patterns, really has the opposite effect. Silence usually communicates disagreement. So if you go in and you talk away, talk, and your client and their family are not saying anything, listening, and then go, okay, and head out the door, you may intuitively go, well, that went well. They didn't tell me they thought that plan was rubbish. They didn't disagree with what I said. They sat there and listened the whole time. Yeah, all right, good. Client agrees with proposed plan. Coming from an Aboriginal perspective, they've signalled to you their disagreement quite strongly, and you've completely missed it. So be very, very wary of silence. It doesn't mean the same thing that we would take it to mean in Western communication styles. These are two that are perhaps a bit more difficult to incorporate, but it's the idea that the value of new knowledge is significantly determined by the person who holds and imparts the new knowledge and the relationship between teacher and student. Thank you. And again, knowledge should only be given by legitimate owners of the knowledge. So one of the consequences or implications of this is don't ask someone to tell another person's story. People may get very uncomfortable, very hesitant. You know, if you're trying to say, so your brother had orders and one of his orders was not to drink and he drank, what happened to him? You think you're teaching. You think you're helping them to learn a lesson. What you're doing is asking them to tell somebody else's story that they may not be authorised to tell. feel very uncomfortable by that, quite possibly won't get a response or will get very, very limited response, and they're going to be thinking far more about why are they asking me to say something that I shouldn't say, rather than going, I'm learning a really valuable lesson about not drinking alcohol. And in a similar way, don't ask people to speak up on behalf of others. Skills or knowledge that threatens a person's sense of identity, culture and language or tradition is likely to be rejected, or there'll be decreased motivation to learn it. And that goes back to that general principle about adult learners. We're not a blank slate. We have things that we believe, we see the world in certain ways, and when somebody comes along and tries to ask us to do something that's contrary to what we believe or contrary to what we think is important, we're not going to really want to take that on board. And I think in the Territory at least, a common area where this plays out with directions and orders around associations, saying non-association with particular people who they may be in kinship relationships to and have kinship obligations, orders that you must remain in a particular community, which the implication or the effect is that the person can't then attend a funeral or another ceremony that they have a strong obligation to do. And I think we have to take a realistic view and say that if it's a tension between you as a corrections officer and their kinship obligations, you're going to lose. We're going to lose. They're going to follow through on what's most important to them, and that's family and culture, their sense of identity. So by asking people to do things that are in direct conflict with their sense of identity and culture, you're really setting them up to fail. And often I would say it says more about the appropriateness of the orders or what we're requesting than it does about the client's ability to comply or not comply. You can achieve the same types of things by bringing family into it. So if there's a really strong reason why somebody can't or shouldn't go to a particular funeral, work with the custodians of that funeral and ask them to direct the person not to come to the funeral. You're working within their sense of identity and their kinship systems rather than working across it. You get the same outcome. Well, you've put the same order in place, but you're going to get a much better outcome. So, possible applications from a learning styles point of view. Don't use questioning as a teaching method. We use this all the time. It's a natural teaching method in Western teaching styles. Repeated questioning is very, very uncomfortable in traditional Aboriginal communication styles. One question after the next, after the next, after the next. If you're in a situation where you have to engage in repeated questioning because you're doing an assessment or something of that sort, be upfront about it and say, look, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you lots and lots of questions. The reason I have to do this is because my boss tells me and I'll get in trouble if I don't, whatever the reason is. But identify that you're aware that you're going to be causing them social discomfort by engaging in repeated questioning. Don't ask people to speculate on a hypothetical or future event. Tell a story about yourself or another person and what they did in a similar situation. Avoid asking questions you already know the answer to. Again, we do this all the time as an intuitive learning approach in Western communication styles. So what's 2 + 2? Like, well, you know. Asking questions that you know the answer to is often seen as very rude or potentially trying to trick or trap somebody. Why would you be asking if you already know the answer? Don't assume silence means that a person agrees or accepts what you say. Minimise the extent to which you put somebody in conflict with kinship or cultural obligations, and work together with family and elders so that you're working within a person's sense of identity and kinship structures. A lot to take in, but I guess the conclusion I'd like to leave is just to say we do, I firmly believe, have the obligations to be the ones who are across this. We're the professionals, we're the ones who are engaged in this space. We need to be aware of our own communication styles and how that either enhances or inhibits somebody else to receive new information. And it is something that can be learned and developed. There is a system to it. It's not just hit and miss. If we make an effort and work on it year after year, we will become better communicators, and then all the rest of the hard work that we do will ultimately be far more effective. Thank you.